One of English history's most infamous events was the Gunpowder Plot. Every year it's commemorated on the 5th of November with fireworks, bonfires and guys being placed onto fires. We all know about Guy Fawkes and how he was caught in the undercrofts and basements of the Houses of Parliament guarding the gunpowder which was planned to blow up the famous government buildings and King James I and much of his government to Kingdom Come. Guy Fawkes himself was brutally tortured after his arrest and was broken at the Tower of London following his racking, in which forced a confession from the Catholic plotter. However, we don't know as much about the other men who were linked to the Gunpowder Plot. Today we look at who these gunpowder plotters were, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. So on the 5th of November 1605, Guy Fawkes was caught inside the Houses of Parliament with the barrels of explosives, but he did not act alone. The plot featured 13 people working together in a bold attempt to kill the king, his government, and to make a huge stand. We'll start by briefly talking about Guy Fawkes, before moving on to the other 12 conspirators. Guy Fawkes was recruited as a gunpowder expert. He was the one who was infamously caught red-handed in the basements under the Houses of Lords. Guy Fawkes himself was a strong Catholic, and during his life he became a soldier who fought for the Spanish against the Dutch. He gained a reputation for being very technical during this time, and he even possibly discussed the Spanish invasion of England. His involvement in the plot came in 1604, when he was recruited by Thomas Winter, and once he arrived into London, he was greeted by Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy, who briefed Fawkes on the plans. Fawkes would then pretend to be Percy's servant at the time, and Percy had rented the house next to the House of Lords. Initially, work on digging a tunnel from here into the House of Lords basement was considered and tried, but it was then decided to in fact rent a room in the basement itself. Fawkes went away during the summer of 1605, but arrived back in London to add final details to the plan, and he was ready to carry out the attack. During searches of the Houses of Lords basements, Fawkes was found at first looking after a large amount of firewood, and he initially convinced guards that this was nothing untowards, but following a second search, he was discovered again, along with the gunpowder. Following his arrest, as mentioned, he was tortured brutally on the rack at the Tower of London, and after standing firm for a few days, he did give up information. We've covered Fawkes' execution in another video, but in summary, as he was led to be hanged, drawn and quartered, he leapt off the scaffold breaking his neck, before the brutal sentence was still carried out. Robert Catesby is known as the mastermind behind the whole plot, and as the man whose schemes could have changed the face of English history forever. He was born to loyal Catholic parents and was a charismatic person, and he was a born leader who people remain loyal to. He was devoutly religious later in his life, but became embroiled in Robert Devereux' rebellion, Essex's rebellion, in which he rode into London to demand a meeting with the Queen. Following the unsuccessful attempt where the Earl of Essex tried to gain favour, Catesby was injured, thrown in prison and then fined. Because of his political alliances and also these acts, he was considered by the government to have been rather dangerous, and in 1602 he allegedly had been involved in negotiations with the Spanish to start a rebellion in England. Following Elizabeth I's death, he was considered so dangerous that he was arrested as a precaution by the government. Catesby really is the kingpin in the Gunpowder Plot. After seeing that the Spanish weren't going to help the Catholics in England following James I's ascension to the throne, he decided things needed to change. Because of his charisma, he managed to recruit a number of people to help the plot, and he would discreetly share his plans with the growing number of allies. When the plot was discovered, Catesby quickly fled London with a number of his allies, and after failing to convince Catholics in the Midlands to join a rebellion, he headed inside Holbeche House in Staffordshire. When the authorities reached Holbeche House, the conspirators decided they would go out in a blaze of glory. Savage fighting took place, and during the shootout and siege, the same musket ball hit Catesby and another conspirator, Thomas Percy, and they both died from their injuries. Efforts were made to try and save Robert Catesby and bring him to trial to gain more information, but he couldn't be saved. His head was then cut off after death and taken to London and stuck on the roof of the House of Commons as a stark warning to the public. Francis Tresham was one of the conspirators who did waver in his devotion to the plot, and is seen as a reluctant member of the plot who could have been the one who exposed the whole thing. His family were rather high class, and he was a cousin of Robert Catesby, the mastermind, and was also friends with the Wrights, two other conspirators. Similarly to Catesby, he was involved in Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex revolt against Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Cecil. In the same vein as Catesby, he was also fined and imprisoned once this failed, and he also involved himself in discussions with the Spanish to begin rebellions. Francis Tresham's personality emanated slight suspicion for the other members of the plot, as they didn't reveal the full details to Tresham until very late. They thought he wasn't trustworthy and that he could whistleblow on the whole plan. Tresham's father had recently died come 1605, and it was thought that he had access to lots of money, and Catesby particularly showed an interest in this. Robert Catesby had allegedly asked Tresham for large sums of money and to use Rushton Hall, his home, but Tresham later only gave smaller sums of money. He was very doubtful, and he didn't like the idea of the plot and began to become appalled at the aims of the conspiracy, and he would later claim that he tried to stop the plot as a whole and was intending to escape his involvement by leaving England. It's also been pointed out that Tresham was most probably the writer of a letter which fell into the wrong hands. The Monteagle letter was sent to William Parker, the 4th Baron Monteagle, and Tresham's brother-in-law. It warned him not to attend Parliament on the 5th of November. Although it's not been proven who sent the letter, suspicion does surround Tresham, as he was brought into the plot in October 1605 at a later stage. The trustworthiness against Tresham played a large part in this, and he himself found the idea of blowing up the House of Lords as foul and disturbing. He denied writing the letter himself, but following the discovery of the plot he was implicated by Guy Fawkes. Francis Tresham was then sent to the Tower of London for imprisonment, and on the 23rd of December 1605 he died from natural causes. Thomas Bates was a loyal servant to Robert Catesby and was involved in the plot during the later months of 1604. He was important in helping dig the tunnel from Thomas Percy's house to the House of Lords, which was the original plan to access the Lords. This wasn't needed once the cellar was rented. When the plot was discovered, Bates rushed back to Holbeche House in Staffordshire with Catesby and the plotters, but left before his master and the others were killed by government forces on the 8th of November. Bates at some point left the house, but was then captured and taken to London. When he was imprisoned, he claimed that Oswald Tesserman knew about the plot, and this implicated also the Jesuits in the plot. Because he was of lower class than the other men, Bates may have fought to reveal information, as he was more likely to be tortured because of his class, which is why he tried to implicate the Jesuits. Later he retracted his confession before his execution. Bates was found guilty of high treason, and he arrived separately from the other conspirators at his trial because of his class. On the 30th of January 1606, he was tied to a hurdle and dragged by a horse through the streets from Gatehouse Prison to St Paul's Churchyard. Here he was hanged, drawn and quartered, meeting a gruesome end, with a number of other conspirators looking on. The Winters were one of two sets of brothers who were integral to the Gunpowder Plot. Thomas Winter was one of the first to be recruited, and his brother Robert then joined up later. The Winters were born into a well-connected Catholic family. Thomas Winter fought abroad in his early life, and was then involved in discussions with the Spanish about helping English Catholics. His early involvement in the plot shows his importance, and Thomas was originally doubtful of its success, and he went to see if the Spanish could help. In Flanders it was Thomas who recruited Guy Fawkes, and when he found out about the betrayal of the plot, he tried very hard to get the conspirators to abandon the plot to blow up Parliament and kill the king. Following the arrest of Fawkes, Thomas Winter fled and then joined up at Holbeche House where the firefight took place, and after the siege he was wounded and captured. Thomas was then executed in Old Palace Yard in London, being found guilty after he confessed, giving a detailed account of the plot. His older brother Robert was drawn into the plot at a later time, as the conspirators might have needed more manpower to carry out the original plan of digging tunnels under the House of Lords. Robert did not stay at Holbeche House for the last stand, but was captured in Worcestershire later and was executed in St Paul's Churchyard. The Wrights were the other set of brothers involved, and they were seen by authorities as being dangerous Catholics even before they were embroiled in the events. Both of them went to the same school as Guy Fawkes, and their sister was married to Thomas Percy, another key conspirator. They were also connected as they knew Robert Catesby, with John Wright being close with him. The government deemed the two to be dangerous, and both had been arrested for suspicion of conspiracy against Elizabeth I in the latter 16th century, and they were also imprisoned following the rebellion of 1601 by Robert Devereux. Like many others in the plot, they were held as preventative measures as Elizabeth I was dying. John Wright was then brought into the plan first, with Christopher Wright being recruited later on. Both of the two were later killed in the shootout at Holbeche House. Thomas Percy was one of the most integral parts of the plot, and he was a violent and unpredictable person who came from a very wealthy family. He was once jailed for brutally killing a Scotsman in a fight in 1596, and he was also a Catholic convert. His family history was very rich, with his great-grandfather being the Earl of Northumberland, and throughout history the Percys were known as an influential family. Thomas was employed by his cousin, the 9th Earl of Northumberland, to go on political missions, and he even had discussions with King James about what would happen to Catholics in England. The Earl became captain of the King's bodyguards, and Percy became linked to the royal court in this sense. He was a close friend of Catesby, and he grew frustrated about the King's backtracking of his word to be lenient with Catholics in England. Following this, he joined up with the plot, and he rented the house next to the House of Lords to possibly tunnel into the Lords, but also he was then the one who rented the basement in 1605 of the House of Lords itself. On the 4th of November, the day before the plot, he ate with the Earl and tried to work out if the plan had been discovered. He would definitely have been implicated if it was, as it was him who rented the basement where Fawkes was found. Following this, he then fled and was found with the other conspirators in Staffordshire where the shootout occurred on the 8th of November, and he was killed in the crossfire. Following his death, his head was cut off as was Catesby's and stuck on a spike on the roof of the House of Commons. The plan to blow up Parliament needed a few things, but it also needed large amounts of money to fund and back it. Ambrose Rookwood, a Catholic, inherited his father's estates and became in 1600 very wealthy. He was then recruited into the plot by Catesby, and his wealth was utilised to bankroll the plot, and also he owned a lot of good horses, and these were used by the conspirators. He was sympathetic to the cause, and was brought in 2 months before it was discovered. Rookwood was captured with many other conspirators at Holbeche House, and was tried in London, being executed in Old Palace Yard on the 31st of January 1606. John Grant was the brother-in-law to the Winters, and he owned a house close to Stratford-upon-Avon, which was considered to have been an important stronghold. He had been involved in Essex's rebellion, like so many before, against the Queen and Robert Cecil, and was brought into the plot in March 1605. Over the course of the year, he seemed to accumulate a large number of weapons, and he also met other conspirators on the 4th of November in Northamptonshire. After the failure, he was also present at the shootout and was blinded by an accident involving gunpowder that took place at Holbeche House. Following his capture, Grant was taken to London and was tried and executed in St Paul's Churchyard, being hanged, drawn and quartered. Robert Keyes was linked to Ambrose Rookwood through his wife and was brought into the plot in October 1604. His job in the mission was to keep an eye and look after the gunpowder and any other gathered equipment which was stored at Thomas Percy's house at Lambeth in London. He did leave the capital when the plan was foiled, but he did not meet up with the other conspirators, but was eventually captured later and executed in Old Palace Yard on the 31st of January. When he was on the scaffold, he asserted his belief that the plot was justified and that the King's treatment of Catholics was very wrong. Sir Everard Digby was a Catholic who was recruited because of his wealth. He was told about the plot but had his reservations initially, before becoming immersed in the conspiracy. His wealth would have helped to pay for much of the equipment which was gathered, such as the gunpowder. He stayed with Robert Catesby at Holbeche House, but before the last stand he left the house and was later captured. During his imprisonment he wrote a number of letters to his family and wife, and he later pleaded guilty. He was allowed to make a speech and outlined the fact that he believed it was justified as the king had backtracked on his promises to Catholics, and he was later executed in St Paul's Churchyard. So although we mostly know about Guy Fawkes when considering the Gunpowder Plot, there were a number of other men who were integral to the planning and the financing of the plot. If the explosion would have occurred and Parliament would have been blown up, along with the royalty, then England would still be incredibly different today. Today the Gunpowder Plot would be labelled as an act of terrorism, But this band of men, who intended to cause extreme damage to the political and royal system of England, were obviously very tired of life in the country and tired of the treatment of Catholics. Maybe it's about time that we consider the importance of these men over Guy Fawkes, especially those such as Robert Catesby, who was really important to the whole episode. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.